Welcome back to Audible Archives. I'm Rob, your host, guiding you once more through the shadows of Ashford. Tonight's tale carries us behind locked doors into a chamber where silence holds its breath. Detective Drake Vane steps into a mystery steeped in grief, inheritance, and secrets that refuse to stay buried. This is the widow's room, where memory lingers and the living are never alone. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Every gesture keeps these mysteries alive and ensures you never miss the next case.
The rain came down in a steady curtain that blurred Ashford's tramlines into glowing streaks. Drake Vane stood just outside the door of Marrow & Company, a solicitor's office wedged between a jeweler's and an old tobacconist. The lamps along Core Street buzzed faintly, casting the slick cobbles in a jaundiced glow. He pulled his coat tighter, brushed the water from his scarf, and stepped inside. The clerk at the desk barely looked up. "Detective Vane?" Drake gave a small nod. His voice was low, steady, deliberate. "Marrow sent for me." The clerk pointed toward the inner office, and Drake crossed the dim corridor, the sound of his boots softened by threadbare carpet. He knocked once, then entered. Arthur Marrow was the sort of solicitor who looked carved out of paper and ink, narrow, pale, tidy. His spectacles glimmered when he rose from behind a stack of briefs. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Detective, I appreciate you coming. This is not a matter for the department's eyes." "Not yet." Drake sat, setting his gloves on the armrest. "Then whose eyes?" Marrow leaned forward, lowering his voice. "A client of mine, Mrs. Eleanor Hatherleigh. Widow, recently bereaved. Her husband died last week at a country inn outside the city. The coroner wrote it as heart failure. The local constable closed the matter in a day." He paused, tapping a thin finger on the desk. "She insists it was murder." The word hung between them. Drake studied Marrow's lined face. "Insists or suspects? She swore to me that someone killed him in their room. And, detective, she fears she will be next." For a long moment, Drake listened to the rain against the office window. Then he spoke, calm and even. "Where is she now?" "In Ashford. She's staying at her brother's townhouse, waiting to see if I can bring someone discreet." Marrow pushed a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a note, written in a hurried but elegant hand. The words were smudged with grief. "They say he died in his sleep, but I know better." The room held someone else's breath. Drake closed the envelope, slid it into his coat. "You want me to take a walk out to this inn? Look around?" Marrow nodded once. "You'll see what I mean when you meet her. She's frightened, but not foolish." Drake rose, taking his gloves back. "I'll speak to her tonight. Then I'll see the place myself." The townhouse sat on the edge of Ashford's quieter quarter, where gas lamps burned brighter and coal soot clung less thickly to the stone. A maid showed Drake to the drawing room, where Eleanor Hatherleigh stood near the fireplace. She was younger than he expected, not more than 30, dressed in black silk, her hair pinned neatly. Her hands twisted the edge of a handkerchief, but her eyes, gray-green, sharp, followed him as he entered. "You're Marrow's detective," she said, her voice soft but taut as a violin string. "Drake Vane." He inclined his head. "I hear you've doubts about your husband's death." She didn't sit. She moved toward the window, looking out at the rain. "Doubts? No. I know. Henry was strong. He had no ailments, no history of weakness. And yet, in that inn, in that room, something happened. He woke once in the night, I remember, gasping, and then—" Her voice caught. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "They say his heart stopped, but I felt it. Someone had been in that room." Drake remained still, his tone calm. "What made you so sure?" She turned, her eyes fixed on him. "Because when I woke, I smelled perfume. Not mine. Not any I own. Something sweet, cloying, heavy, as though someone had stood over us." A silence stretched. The only sound was the patter of rain on glass. Drake noted the tremor in her fingers, the clarity in her eyes. She wasn't raving, she was precise. "What inn was it?" he asked. "The Bell Mare. On the road past the marshlands. They put us in the West Wing. Room 6. Drake pulled out his notebook, pencil scratching softly. "And who else stayed there?" She shook her head. "I didn't see. Henry kept the accounts. But the innkeeper was nervous, almost eager for us to leave when Henry died. He offered no condolences, just pressed us to be gone." Drake closed the notebook. "I'll see this Bell Mare for myself." She moved closer, desperation breaking through her composure. "Detective Vane, you must find it. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I smell that perfume. And I see Henry." She stopped, swallowing hard. "If the constable won't believe me, and the coroner won't look again, then you must." Drake gave a single nod. "I'll believe what the evidence tells me. Nothing less, nothing more." The Bell Mare encrouched by the roadside like a relic. Its stone walls were streaked with damp, its windows dulled with grime. A lantern swung over the door, creaking in the wind. Drake stepped inside, boots scuffing the warped floorboards. The innkeeper was a stout man with red cheeks and nervous eyes. He started when he saw Drake's badge, half hidden in his coat. "I'm not here on official duty," Drake said quietly. "Just a traveler curious about your rooms." The man licked his lips, wiped his hands on his apron. "We've few travelers these days, sir. Trade's gone down. The marshes make folk uneasy." Drake leaned on the counter. "I'd like to see room 6. The innkeeper hesitated, then forced a smile. "That room's closed. After the incident." "Closed," Drake repeated. He straightened, his eyes fixed like steel. "Show me, anyway." The man faltered, then fumbled for a key. He led Drake down a narrow corridor, the floor groaning under their steps, until they reached a door at the far end. He unlocked it, pushed it open. The room was simple: a bed, a wardrobe, a small table. The air was stale, heavy with dust. But underneath, faint, almost lost in time, Drake caught a trace of something, sweet, cloying, perfumed. He stepped further inside, scanning with careful eyes. His fingers brushed the wardrobe's edge. A scratch ran along the floor, as though the heavy piece of furniture had been moved. He crouched, sliding his knife from his pocket, prying gently at the floorboards beneath the wardrobe's leg. The wood lifted with a sigh, revealing a narrow gap. Inside lay the torn corner of a lace handkerchief, stiff with age, and a glass vial no bigger than his thumb. Drake lifted it, uncorked it, and the perfume wafted up, sickly, lingering. Behind him, the innkeeper shifted nervously. "Best leave that, sir. Old rubbish, nothing more." Drake turned, his voice low, even. "Nothing more, or everything." He slipped the vial into his pocket. Outside, the storm rolled over the marshes, and in the dark corridor, the Bell Mare seemed less like an inn and more like a stage, its actors hiding just off the wings, waiting to speak. Drake Vane knew the widow was right about one thing. Someone else had been in that room. The rain had not let up by morning. It slicked the marshland roads and turned the air thick with mist. Drake Vane stood outside the Bell Mare, his coat collar raised, notebook open, pencil scratching down quick impressions. He believed in catching first impressions before the place could wear itself into familiarity. The Belmare was no ordinary roadside inn. Too many contradictions hung about it. Shabby furniture, but new locks on the doors. Warped beams, but expensive curtains faded only by damp. An innkeeper too eager to dismiss tragedy, and a room that still breathed another presence. Drake's steel-gray eyes shifted to the inn's side door. He had noticed a scullery maid carrying coal that way earlier. He decided it was time to see who kept the wheels turning beneath the inn's nervous surface. The kitchen was a cave of clanging pans, steam, and the bitter tang of onions. A girl in a patched dress looked up sharply when Drake entered. She was perhaps 17, her hands red from scrubbing. "You lost?" she asked, wary but not timid. Drake gave a faint half-smile. "Depends who I'm looking for. You're the maid. That's what they call me." She turned back to the sink, scrubbing harder than necessary. "If you're here about Mr. Hatherleigh, I don't know nothing. You know more than the innkeeper once told." Her hands froze. Slowly, she set the rag aside. "Who are you?" "Drake Vane." He spoke his name like a steady card laid on the table. "I'm not here to make trouble for you. I just want to know what you saw, or smelled." At that, her eyes flicked toward him, sharp, afraid. "Smelled. The perfume." She paled. "You smelled it too." Drake waited, letting the silence draw her words. "It weren't from the lady's things," she whispered. "I was in that room after they took him away. Just me, cleaning. And it was still there. Sweet. Heavy. Made my head ache. I told Mr. Broom, that's the innkeeper. He near boxed my ears for saying it. Told me to scrub the boards with lye till my hands bled, and not another word." Drake leaned against the doorframe, calm. "Did anyone else come or go that night?" She hesitated, biting her lip. There was a knock at the side door, past midnight. "I thought it was one of the draymen, but when I looked through the crack, it was a woman. Veil on, black coat. Broom let her in. I swear I heard her go down the hall toward the west wing." Her eyes darted around, as if the walls themselves might punish her. "I never saw her leave." By late afternoon, Drake stood again in room 6, this time alone. The handkerchief scrap and vial sat on the bed before him. He thought of the widow's words. The room held someone else's breath. Drake uncorked the vial once more, closing his eyes. He let the scent burn into his memory, roses mixed with something sharper, almost chemical. Not a fragrance sold in every corner shop. This had been crafted, perhaps foreign. He replaced the cork, slipped the vial back into his coat, and crossed to the wardrobe. Kneeling, he traced the scratches again where it had been dragged. Whoever hid the vial had done so in haste. A panicked move, not careful concealment. A knock came at the door. Not sharp, not hesitant, measured. Drake rose, hand brushing the butt of his Webley under his coat. He opened the door. A man stood there, tall, angular, with hair slicked back and a smile too polished. His suit was better cut than the inn deserved. "Forgive the intrusion," the man said, voice smooth as oil. "I hear you're taking an interest in the Hatherleigh death." Drake didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. The man's smile deepened. "My name's Mr. Vale. I represent interests who prefer the past remain undisturbed. The Lady Hatherleigh is grieving. The innkeeper is nervous. And you, Detective Vane, are far from your station." Drake's voice was calm, flat. "Go on." Vale stepped closer, his cologne faint but sharp, different from the vial's perfume. "There is no story here worth your ink. Let it die with the poor fellow. Walk away, and Ashford will forget this ever troubled you." Drake's eyes did not blink. "And if I don't?" Vale's smile never broke. "Then you'll find the marshes have a way of swallowing men whole." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the air between them heavy, charged. Then Vale tipped his hat, turned, and walked down the corridor with slow, deliberate steps. Drake closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a slow breath. The case had changed shape. This was no longer about a widow's suspicion. Someone powerful wanted this buried. And when power played that hard, there was always truth worth unearthing. He picked up the vial again, its perfume clinging to the air like a ghost. Someone had been in this room. And someone else was willing to threaten a detective to keep their shadow hidden. The mist didn't lift the next morning. It rolled in heavier, swallowing hedgerows and leaving the marsh road to the Belmare, a pale ribbon in the distance. Drake Vane returned to Ashford on the first tram, the vial of perfume secured in his inner pocket. His instincts told him the truth wasn't buried in damp floorboards or shuttered rooms. It was tied to people, to histories that stretched back before the night of Mr. Hatherleigh's death. Ashford's heart beat louder than the countryside ever could. Tram bells clanged, soot rose from the furnace quarter, and the marketplace buzzed with dockhands hawking smuggled wares. Drake wove through it all, his coat damp from the mist, his eyes fixed on the narrow streets behind the chemist district. Perfume wasn't bought in ordinary shops. Not the kind he'd smelled in room 6. The sign read Leclerc's Essences and Adders, its paint peeling, the windows clouded with dust and glass bottles. Drake pushed open the door. A bell chimed, faint and delicate, at odds with the shop's stale air. Behind the counter stood a thin, bird-like man with pince-nez glasses. He looked up with the faint irritation of one unused to company. "You're not one of my patrons," he said, voice clipped. "No," Drake admitted. He set the vial on the counter, uncorked just enough to let the scent drift. "But perhaps one of your patrons is mine." Leclerc leaned in, inhaled once, and his sharp face flickered with recognition. "That," he said slowly, "is Rose Écarlate. Not common. A Parisian import. Very dear. I've sold but 3 bottles in the last year." Drake's gaze sharpened. To whom? Leclerc hesitated. His fingers toyed with a balance scale. "Confidentiality." "Confidentiality doesn't cover murder," Drake cut in, steel in his tone. The shopkeeper swallowed, then sighed. "Very well. 1 bottle went to a lady in the theater, Miss Isabel Devenant. Another to a gentleman from the dock sprawl. I believe he called himself Vale. The third—" He trailed off, eyes narrowing. Drake waited. "The third was ordered by post. Paid in advance. No name. Sent to the Belmare Inn. Addressed only to room 6. By late afternoon Drake sat in a narrow tea shop across from the Ashford Playhouse, his notebook open, watching the stage door. The name Vale had already tied the threads tighter. But now Isabel Devenant entered the weave, a name he knew faintly. She was an actress with a rising star, always flanked by men with money and shadows. At 4:30, she emerged in a plum coat, veil pulled low. Drake rose, followed her at a distance through the cobblestone lanes until she slipped into a carriage waiting by the clock tower. Through the drizzle, Drake caught a glimpse of the driver. It was the same angular face, the same slicked hair. Vale. The carriage clattered off toward the western road, the same road that led to the Belmare. That night, Drake returned to the widow Eleanor's townhouse. She was in the drawing room again, a fire hissing in the grate. She looked up when he entered, her face pale, haunted. "You've found something." "I found enough to know your husband wasn't alone in that room," Drake said evenly. "He set the vial on her mantle. That perfume belonged to someone else. A woman, Isabel Devenant, and a man named Vale. Both tied to your husband in ways I've yet to untangle." Eleanor flinched at the names. Her teacup rattled against the saucer. "Then I was right," she whispered. "I knew he hadn't died clean. But why? Why involve them?" Drake studied her carefully. "That's what I'll learn next. But you should know, Mrs. Hatherleigh, whoever brought that perfume into your room also left threats in mine. Vale wants this buried." Her hands tightened around the porcelain. "And you won't let it be." Drake's steel-gray eyes held hers, steady as stone. "I don't walk away from shadows. I drag them out where they can be seen." The fire popped, throwing sparks. Eleanor leaned back, a strange look crossing her face. Relief mingled with fear, and something else Drake couldn't name yet. Outside, in the fog-choked street, a carriage wheel splashed through a puddle. A figure lingered in the mist, watching Drake leave the townhouse. The figure lit a cigarette, the ember flaring once, before dissolving into the night. The net was tightening, and Drake could feel, in the marrow of his bones, that room 6 of the Belmare was only the beginning. The playhouse was still buzzing with chatter when Drake pushed through the velvet curtains into the dim back corridor. He had timed it well. Isabel Devenant had just come off stage, the applause still echoing in the boards overhead. Her dressing room door stood half ajar, light spilling onto the scuffed floor. He knocked once. "Not now, darling," came a lilting voice. Drake stepped inside anyway. The room smelled of powder and roses, stage paint and sweat. Isabel sat before a gilt-edged mirror, rouge still bright on her cheeks, dark eyes wide as they caught his reflection. "You're not one of mine," she said coolly, hand hovering over a glass of sherry. "I'm not here to flatter." Drake closed the door behind him. "I'm here about room 6 at the Belmare Inn." The glass trembled in her hand. She set it down carefully. "I don't know what you mean." "You wore rose écarlate," Drake said evenly. "Perfume bought from Leclerc. The same perfume that hung in the air of that room when your friend, Mr. Hatherleigh, died." For a moment, only the sound of her breath filled the room. Then she laughed, sharp and brittle. "Hatherleigh was no friend. He was a patron. A foolish man with too much coin and too little imagination. If he died in that room, it was none of my doing. Yet you were there." Drake stepped closer, eyes catching hers in the mirror. "And Vale drove you." The name broke her composure. She turned sharply. "Vale has nothing to do with this." "Vale has everything to do with this," Drake said. "He's the thread in both directions. To you, and to the widow. And if I pull hard enough, I'll see the whole tapestry unravel." Isabel rose from her chair, pacing the small room, skirts swishing. "You think Eleanor's a saint? That sweet pale widow sipping tea? She brought me there, detective. She invited me. Said her husband wanted to see the truth of what he'd married. Said he needed a spectacle before she'd be rid of him." Drake's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Eleanor set you up?" "I'm saying she wanted him gone," Isabel snapped. "And when it happened, she had someone else's perfume to point the finger at. Mine." Drake didn't move. He let the silence hang, heavy as a noose. "Then why come? Why play along?" Her laugh was hollow. "Because she paid me. And because when Eleanor asks, you don't say no." The streets outside the playhouse were slick with rain. Drake lit a cigarette, the match flaring in the fog, his thoughts running dark. Eleanor had insisted she was frightened, powerless. But Isabel's words had the bitter taste of truth. Too many threads now tied back to the widow's soft-spoken voice, her pale hands clutching a teacup. As he walked, a carriage rumbled from the shadows. Vale was on the driver's seat again, hat pulled low. The wheels splashed past, close enough to drench Drake's boots. He didn't flinch, just watched the man vanish into the mist. The city itself seemed to whisper with hidden voices. Eleanor's tremor, Isabel's venom, Vale's silence. Somewhere in that knot was the truth. And Drake Vane intended to cut it loose. By midnight he was back in his flat above the tea shop, damp coat slung over the chair, notebooks spread on the desk. He mapped the names and places. Eleanor Hatherleigh, widow, claims innocence. Isabel Devenant, actress, admits presence, claims Eleanor staged it. Vale, driver, shadow, muscle. At the center, in heavy ink, room 6. Perfume, death, silence. The pen scratched, steady, until a knock rattled the door. Not the neighbor's timid rap, but a firm 3-tap rhythm. Drake slid the revolver from his drawer before he opened the door. On the landing stood Vale, rain dripping from his hat. "You should leave this alone," Vale said quietly, voice rough with gravel. "The widow isn't what she seems. Neither are her games. Men like me, we're paid to clean the edges. But you," he tilted his head, "you're too curious for your own good." Drake held his gaze, revolver at his side. "And you talk too much for a man who wants me to walk away." Vale's mouth twitched, a half smile, half threat. Then he tipped his hat and vanished back into the stairwell. Drake closed the door, locked it, and sat again at his desk. He didn't need Vale's warning to know the danger had sharpened. But the truth was close now, close enough to taste. The rain hammered Ashford's rooftops. Somewhere in the dark, Eleanor waited with her secrets. And Drake Vane, steel-eyed and steady, was ready to hear her lie again. Only this time, he would be listening for the crack in her voice. The next day broke gray and wet, the kind of weather that clung to Ashford like a second skin. Drake left his flat early, coat collar turned up, scarf knotted tight. The tram lines hissed in the drizzle as he cut across Ashford Core toward the Hatherleigh residence. The widow had invited him back, or rather, her solicitor had, in a letter delivered by hand at dawn. Polite words on heavy stationery. "Mrs. Hatherleigh wishes to clarify her account." Drake read it twice, then tucked it into his coat. A clarification meant one of two things: a shift in the story, or a tightening of the noose. The Hatherleigh townhouse loomed at the edge of the common, its tall windows weeping condensation, its brass knocker dulled by the damp. A butler let him in without a word, leading him past a hall of oil portraits and ticking clocks. Eleanor waited in the drawing room, wrapped in mourning black. "Detective Vane," she said softly. "You came quickly. You asked quickly." He sat opposite her, noting the tea already poured, steam curling in the air. "What's changed?" She clasped her hands together, the motion too precise, as if rehearsed. "I've remembered something. That night, at the inn, I wasn't alone in the corridor." Drake's brows lifted slightly. "Go on." "There was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered. I only saw him for a moment, but he passed by my husband's door just before." She trailed off, eyes wetting. "Before I found him." "A man," Drake said flatly. "Not your driver?" Her lips tightened. "No. Someone else." Drake leaned forward. "You're certain?" Her gaze flickered, just enough to betray the lie. He set his teacup down carefully. "Strange, isn't it? That such a detail slipped your mind until today." Eleanor's breath quickened. "Do you think I'm lying?" "I think," Drake said, voice low, "you're trying to paint shadows around yourself so the outline of your figure blurs." The silence stretched. The only sound was the grandfather clock marking the seconds between them. Then she whispered, "You don't understand, detective. My husband's death, it wasn't murder. It was justice." Drake's jaw tightened. Justice at whose hand? But Eleanor only looked down, tears catching the light. Back on the streets, Drake's thoughts churned. Eleanor's story was cracking. First fear, now confession laced with righteousness. She wasn't powerless, she was playing a role. And Isabel's warning echoed in his mind. She brought me there. She wanted a spectacle. By dusk, Drake stood in the Belmare Inn again, in room 6. The air smelled faintly of polish and dust, but if he closed his eyes, he could almost summon the ghost of perfume. He walked the room slowly, tracing every seam of the wallpaper, every notch in the floorboards. And then his boot caught something, a slight give under the rug. He knelt, pulling the edge back. Beneath, a loose plank. Inside, dust, a cobweb, and a folded scrap of fabric. A handkerchief. Delicate lace, monogrammed with an E, and stained at one corner with something dark, faded, but unmistakable, blood. Drake slipped it into his coat pocket, his pulse steady but hard. As he left the inn, the fog pressed heavy around him. From the shadows across the street, a figure detached itself. Vale again, as if the man lived in the corners of this case. "You shouldn't be here," Vale said. His eyes flicked to Drake's coat. "You found something. Maybe. Then burn it." Vale's tone carried no threat, just a weary inevitability. "If you hold it, you'll hang her. And if you hang her, the city will bleed in ways you don't see yet." Drake lit a cigarette, smoke curling between them. "Funny thing," he said. "I didn't come back to Ashford to look away." Vale's jaw clenched. For a moment, Drake thought he'd strike. Instead, the driver tipped his hat and melted back into the mist, leaving the echo of his warning hanging heavier than the fog. That night in his flat, Drake laid the handkerchief on his desk beside his revolver and notebook. The monogram gleamed faintly in the lamplight. He wrote a single line beneath it. Eleanor's justice, written in blood. And for the first time since he'd returned to Ashford, Drake felt the city's weight pressing in, as though the case wasn't just about one dead man in one locked room. It was about the masks people wore, the games they played, and the quiet wars fought in the shadows of wealth and power. The following morning brought with it a brittle kind of clarity, the sort that usually precedes a storm. The rain had lifted, but the air carried the metallic tang of thunder waiting in the distance. Drake stood by his narrow window, a cup of tea cooling in his hand, watching the trams rattle down the core. Ashford was restless. He could feel it in the bricks. On his desk, the blood-stained handkerchief waited, folded neatly beside his notebook. Eleanor's glared back at him like a verdict. By mid-afternoon, he was walking through the stone archway of Hatherleigh Manor once more. The butler took his coat reluctantly, and Drake noticed the stiffness in the man's shoulders. Even the servants here were beginning to feel the strain. Eleanor greeted him in the study this time, a cavern of leather-bound books and shuttered windows. She looked different, not broken, not grieving, but composed, almost radiant in her black dress, as though mourning had become a costume she had grown comfortable in. "Detective Vane," she said smoothly. "You're relentless." Drake set the handkerchief down on her desk. The lace and stain caught the dim light. Her fingers twitched ever so slightly. "Your justice," Drake said, his voice even, "was messy." For the first time, Eleanor faltered. She pressed her lips together, then exhaled through her nose. "So you found it. You planted it," Drake corrected. "Hid it like a keepsake, a reminder." She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "You think me so sentimental? No, detective. I left it there for someone like you. Someone who would dig, who would scratch the surface until the truth spilled out." Drake tilted his head. "And what truth am I meant to see?" Her eyes glimmered with something between triumph and sorrow. That Robert Hatherleigh's death was not a crime. It was the inevitable consequence of his own sins. Call it murder if you like, but I call it balance. Drake studied her face. There was no hysteria there, no nervous twitch, just conviction. Dangerous, unyielding conviction. "Balance doesn't bleed a man out," he said. Her smile was small, almost pitying. "No, but it ends the bleeding he caused in others." Leaving the manor, Drake felt the edges of the case fray further. Eleanor wasn't confessing, she was preaching. That made her dangerous in ways most murderers weren't. She wasn't hiding from justice, she was claiming to embody it. By nightfall, he found himself back at the Belmare Inn, lantern in hand. The manager had closed the upstairs corridor, muttering about police business. Drake paced the length of the hall, testing every door, every lock. Room 6 felt different now, charged as if the walls themselves were listening. A faint scrape drew his attention. From the far end of the hall, near the servants' stairwell, a door eased shut. Drake's boots whispered over the floorboards as he moved quickly, lantern low. He reached the stairwell, swung the door open. Empty. But the air was thick with tobacco smoke, the kind that clung to heavy coats. Vale. Drake descended into the underbelly of the inn, following the smoke. He found him in the coal cellar, lantern glow catching the hard planes of the man's face. Vale didn't startle. He'd been waiting. "You've got her cornered," Vale said quietly. "Don't make the mistake of thinking that's victory." Drake stepped closer, boots crunching on grit. "What are you shielding, Vale? Her reputation? Her fortune? Or your own neck?" Vale's gaze hardened. "I owe her nothing. But the people she's touched, lives ruined by that man she called a husband, they'll owe her forever. She gave them back a piece of themselves." Drake's voice was iron. "So you helped her." The driver's silence was all the answer he needed. Back in his flat, long after midnight, Drake poured himself a measure of coal-aged whiskey. The handkerchief lay on the desk still, its stain seeming darker in lamplight. He wrote in his notebook, "Eleanor believes in justice. Vale believes in her. Robert Hatherleigh believed in nothing but himself." He underlined the last sentence twice, then sat back, cigarette in hand, and wondered, not for the first time, whether truth and justice were always meant to walk the same road. The days that followed were a study in unease. The city breathed restlessly, as though Eleanor Hatherleigh's calm defiance had stirred something ancient in the marrow of Ashford. Rumors slipped down tramlines and through taverns like smoke, a widow too serene, a detective too stubborn, and a death that didn't rest quiet in its grave. Drake Vane moved with method, piecing together fragments. He spoke to the inn's maid, who swore she'd heard no one enter the corridor that night, though she admitted she'd fallen asleep in her chair by the scullery fire. He visited the coroner, who reluctantly admitted that the cut on Robert Hatherleigh's neck could have been made with surgical precision, too clean for a drunken stumble into a broken glass, as had first been suggested. But the locked door remained the puzzle. Room 6 had been bolted from the inside. No forced entry, no hidden passage. Yet Robert had died there, and someone had left him to bleed. It was at the tea shop beneath his flat, of all places, that Drake found his thread. The old shopkeeper, a woman with hands like parchment and eyes still sharp as pins, mentioned something offhand as she poured his cup. A clever thing, detective, a bolt. Strong when you need it. Useless if someone knows how to thread a string through. Drake froze, cup halfway to his lips. A string. That evening, he returned to the Belmare Inn with a length of twine in his pocket. Alone in room 6, he examined the door's interior bolt. Simple, sturdy, but vulnerable. He threaded the twine through the narrow crack beneath the door, looped it carefully, then tugged. The bolt shifted. Another pull, and it slid home. Locked tight, from the outside. The trick was as old as sleight of hand, and devastatingly effective. Someone had staged the scene. He let the bolt fall open again, jaw tightening. Whoever had killed Robert had planned it with the kind of patience that only comes from practice. The lantern on the nightstand cast a long shadow across the bed where Robert had died. Drake stood there for a moment, imagining the scene. The widow in her room across the hall, Vale perhaps in the stable below, and Robert gasping his last. Somewhere in that tableau, the truth crouched, waiting to be named. He confronted Eleanor the next day. She was in the manor garden, trimming roses with a precision that unsettled him. She didn't flinch when he described the twine trick, didn't deny it, didn't even glance up from the thorns. "So," she murmured, snipping a perfect bloom, "you've solved the riddle of the lock." "You left him bleeding," Drake said. She placed the rose carefully into a waiting vase, crimson petals stark against the glass. "Yes, I did." The words were almost too soft to carry, but they struck harder than any shouted confession. Drake's breath caught. Not triumph, not victory, something heavier, darker. "Why?" he asked finally. Eleanor looked up at him then, her steel eyes unflinching. "Because Robert didn't just drink himself to ruin. He ruined others. Do you know how many women in Ashford still live in shame because of him? How many debts he forced on men who couldn't pay? He was a disease, detective. I only cut away the rot." Drake studied her, the hand with the shears still steady. A woman confessing without fear, a woman who had turned her grief into doctrine. He knew he had her. By law, by fact, by every measure that mattered to the courts of Ashford. He had her. But something in him, some soldier's instinct from years of seeing orders turn men into corpses, whispered that justice didn't live clean in this case. The rose petals trembled in the breeze, blood red against the green. That night, in his flat, Drake poured whiskey again and stared at his notebook. On the page he wrote 3 words, slowly, deliberately. Law, truth, justice, and then beneath them, not the same. He sat there for a long while, the city's pulse echoing through the glass, wondering if he'd become the kind of man Eleanor Hatherleigh believed him to be, or if Ashford itself had already decided the verdict. Drake didn't sleep much the next 2 nights. The city's hum followed him into his dreams, steel wheels shrieking on tramlines, the echo of boots in wet alleys, Eleanor's voice confessing without fear. By the 3rd dawn, he knew he couldn't stall. Justice required action, even if justice wasn't the same thing as truth. He went to the Ashford Magistrates' Court with his notes, his diagrams, his demonstration of the twine bolt trick. The magistrate, a rotund man whose powdered wig looked comically small on his wide head, listened with pursed lips. He wasn't moved by morality, only evidence, and Drake had laid it out clean as glass. An arrest warrant for Eleanor Hatherleigh was signed before the ink on Drake's notebook dried. When Drake and 2 constables arrived at the Hatherleigh estate, Eleanor was at the piano. She didn't stop playing when they entered, some melancholy piece, her fingers coaxing out a dirge that made the walls ache. Only when Drake stepped forward did she lift her gaze, still striking the keys. "So it comes to this," she said. "It does," Drake replied, steady but not unkind. The constables moved to flank her, but she didn't resist. Instead, she let her fingers slide off the keys in a discordant sigh and stood, smoothing her dress. "I won't run. I told you the truth. And now you'll do what you must." Her composure was unnerving. No hysteria, no pleas, only that unshakable steel. But as they turned to lead her away, the study door creaked open, and a thin voice, cracked with age, cut the silence. "Leave her." All eyes turned. In the doorway stood Vale. The stable master, stooped but fierce, his walking stick clenched like a weapon. His face was pale, lips trembling, but his eyes burned. Drake stiffened. "Vale, what are you doing here?" "I'm saving her," the old man rasped. He shuffled forward, the stick tapping on the wood like a death knell. "You're wrong, detective. Eleanor didn't kill him. I did." The constables exchanged startled glances. Eleanor's jaw tightened, the first flicker of fear Drake had ever seen in her. "Don't, Vale," she whispered. "You don't." "Yes, I do," Vale snapped, cutting her off with surprising fire. "I've been carrying this weight too long. The truth's mine to bear." Drake's instincts screamed conflict. He stepped forward, voice low. "If this is a confession, Vale, you'd better explain it straight." The old man's hands shook as he leaned on his stick. "Robert Hatherleigh ruined more than fortunes, detective. He ruined my daughter. Drove her to the river. She drowned, same as he should have." His eyes brimmed with a fury sharpened by decades. "I swore he'd pay. And that night, I made it so. The bolt trick. That was mine. Old soldier taught me long ago." He coughed, harsh and ragged. "I slit his throat clean. Left him locked in. Walked away with his blood on my hands, and I've never lost a night's sleep since." The room hung in stunned silence. Eleanor closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging. It was the first time she'd looked truly human, fragile even. Drake studied them both, the widow who had accepted guilt like a crown, and the servant who now wore it like armor. This was no longer about evidence. It was about choice. Vale's story fit, the mechanics aligned. But Drake's gut whispered something more twisted. A second confession didn't clean the slate, it muddied it further. And he knew Ashford well enough to recognize when the truth had become a performance. Drake's silence stretched across the room like a taut wire. Eleanor stood still, her expression unreadable, while Vale clutched his stick, chest heaving, eyes wet but defiant. The constables shifted uneasily, caught between duty and doubt. Drake finally spoke, his voice level. "You're both lying. But only one of you is lying to protect the other." Eleanor's eyes flashed, sharp and quick, but Vale barked a bitter laugh. "Lying? You've got my confession, detective. Isn't that what you came for?" "I came for the truth," Drake replied, stepping closer, gaze locked on Eleanor. "And the truth is, you've been playing the long game, haven't you? From the moment your husband took his last breath, you crafted the perfect trap. You let Vale stew in his grief, let his hatred fester until he'd convince himself he was guilty. And when I showed up sniffing at the door, you saw your chance to let him take the fall." Vale's mouth fell open. No, She's been protecting you, Vale." Drake cut him off, his tone like steel on stone. "Not by shielding your crime, but by letting you believe there was one to shield." Eleanor's composure cracked just enough to show the glint of admiration. "You really don't miss a beat, do you, Detective Vane?" Drake didn't answer her. He turned to Vale. Robert Hatherleigh wasn't killed with a blade. He was poisoned. Digitalis slipped into his nightly tonic. No slit throat. No heroic vengeance. Just a patient hand and a quiet death. Vale looked stricken, his hands trembling. But the bolt, That was a story someone fed you, Drake said softly. To give shape to your grief. To make you believe you'd done something you hadn't. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. I told you, detective. I was honest. My husband was dead before the blade ever touched him. But truth is malleable, isn't it? Sometimes it's kinder to let others bear a simpler version of it. Her words hung in the air, fragile and damning. Drake exhaled slowly, the shape of the case settling heavy on his shoulders. Eleanor hadn't just killed her husband. She'd rewritten the narrative so thoroughly that even her allies claimed guilt as though it were a badge. It was manipulation of the deepest sort, and in its own way, genius. The constables looked to Drake, waiting for the order. Eleanor watched him with that same cool detachment, as if already knowing which way the scales would tilt. You'll come with us, Drake said finally. His voice was steady, but his chest felt tight. Both of you for now. The courts will decide what story they'll believe. But I know which one's true. Eleanor didn't resist. Vale staggered, tears running down his weathered cheeks. As they led the widow and the servant away, Drake remained in the empty room, staring at the piano where her last notes still seemed to linger. A crime of passion was easy to solve. But a crime of story, a murder where the weapon was narrative itself, that was harder to kill. Ashford had many ghosts, but few as haunting as Eleanor Hatherleigh.
You've just listened to The Widow's Room, written and narrated exclusively for Audible Archives. I'm Rob, and in Ashford the past is never truly gone. It waits, it whispers, and sometimes it demands. If this story drew you deeper into the fog, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps these shadows breathing and ensures the next case is always waiting in the dark. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and stay listening.
Another chapter closes, but the archives remain, waiting for the next seeker of stories. Here, no voice is lost, no tale truly ends. This is Audible Archives. Until we meet again, may your mind wander freely and your heart never forget the stories we share.